If you would like a free newsletter on this or other subjects, just give us a call at Christian Answers. The phone number is area code 512-218-8022. That's 512-218-8022. Or you could email us at cdebater@aol.com. That's cdebater@aol.com. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Lee Meckley, Director of Radio Outreach for Christian Answers, along with Jim Tungate. Jim, how you doing this evening?
I'm doing just great, Lee. How are you doing this evening?
Oh, great. Tonight our guest is Tom Snyder, author of a book called Myth Conceptions, Joseph Campbell and the New Age. And probably the best way to introduce what we're talking about is just to read from the preface, which I found very helpful. Joseph Campbell, author of The Hero with 1,000 Faces and many other books, died in 1987, but his ideas about religion, society, popular culture, and art still fascinate many people. His books are taught on many college campuses and displayed prominently in popular bookstores. The ideas in those books have been accepted by a wide cross-section of the American public, including New Agers, neo-pagans, journalists, environmentalists, political liberals, and nominal Jews and Christians. Filmmaker George Lucas used Campbell's mystical ideas about hero myths to create his popular Star Wars and Indiana Jones films in the late 1970s and 80s. Before Campbell died, PBS reporter and commentator Bill Moyers did a series of 6 one-hour television interviews with Campbell called The Power of Myth, which aired on public television stations across the country. Since 1987, many public TV stations have rerun the series regularly, along with other shows featuring Campbell and his ideas. For example, the public television station in Los Angeles reran The Power of Myth on March 1st, 2nd, and 3rd of 1994, and again on March 5th and 6th of 1994. It is perfectly reasonable to assume, therefore, that even if you have never heard of Joseph Campbell, you probably have met or heard someone supporting one of his popular ideas. So, tonight we will be talking with Tom Snyder, who has written a book to deal with Joseph Campbell specifically and Joseph Campbell's thoughts in general. Tom Snyder teaches philosophy and aesthetics, social science, and film at National University in Southern California. He holds a Ph.D. in film studies from Northwestern University and has done postdoctoral research in Christian apologetics at Simon Greenleaf School of Law. And again, the name of the book is Myth Conceptions, Joseph Campbell and the New Age, published by Baker Bookhouse. And Tom, how are you doing this evening?
Oh, pretty good. How are you?
Just fine. Probably the best place to start is with the book. What were your specific reasons for writing the book?
Well, one, Joseph Campbell's very popular, and two, I have some expertise in the area. When I did film studies over at Northwestern, I did a lot of research in this area, including Campbell, but also other scholars. And so we wanted to do this book because his ideas are so popular right now, and they're still continuing to be popular, even though he died in 1987.
Joseph Campbell is, I guess, just kind of the personification of many ideas that, as you said, have become very popular. And I noticed in your book that you actually talk about 7 influences that Campbell had, or 7...
Yeah, I talk about 7 aspects to his ideas and his books and the TV show that he did with Bill Moyers. They did a book of the sort of like a transcript of those interviews, and that was sold about 1 million copies. So basically, I took these 7 main aspects to his ideas, his 7 major ideas, and just refuted them one by one in my book. That's what I do, and that's why what makes my book unique is because these ideas are out there. Even though people don't hear of Joseph Campbell, they often parrot these ideas and have them in their minds and their heads. And a Christian will encounter them. So what do we do when we encounter some of these ideas?
I thoroughly enjoyed your book, and you did do an excellent job of refuting the philosophy of Joseph Campbell. Now, beginning in Chapter 1, you go through Test for Truth. What are tests for truth?
Well, Joseph Campbell, one of the things he said was he doesn't believe in absolute truth. As a matter of fact, I have a quote in that chapter where he quotes him on this point, and he says, quote, "The person who thinks he has found the ultimate truth is wrong," unquote. So you often encounter the idea that there's no absolute truth. People can often say to you, "There is no absolute truth." Well, I always reply to them, see, what they've done is set their own absolute truth and not called it an absolute truth. They call it something else, tolerance or progressive ideas or evolution, what have you. They've set up their own absolute truths, and then they sort of like undercut their own point that they make. It's sort of like self-contradictory. So what I think we need in this culture is some test. How do we test what's true and what's false? How do we know that the Bible is true? How do we know that Joseph Campbell is false, or what part of his writings or speaking is true? Maybe there's something that's true in it. So I think we need to develop tests for truth in a little bit more systematic way of principles, have some common principles to do that.
What principles do we use to determine what is truth?
Well, for instance, the Bible indicates that God does not lie. So if somebody lies to you or contradicts themselves, then we know that there's something wrong with what they're telling you. So once again, like when someone tells you there are no absolute truths, actually they're kind of contradicting themselves. So are their beliefs internally consistent? Does the virgin birth make sense with the resurrection and the vicarious atonement, Jesus Christ's death on the cross, and everything that means, and the phrase that in 1 Corinthians 15, Jesus died for your sins, or died for our sins. What does that mean, and do these different aspects of the Christian worldview contradict themselves? And does Campbell's worldview contradict itself? So that's the one test for truth. The other test for truth is trying to look for evidence. In recent years, especially the last 100 years or so, people have done archaeological digs in the Middle East on biblical places and biblical people, and tried to do some archaeological digs. And we found out that Pontius Pilate actually existed. They didn't at one time. We didn't know, there was no external verification, but now we've found some external verification. So that just gives some documentation to the biblical text. Also, the biblical text, a lot of people say, well, it's been changed. But we can go back and look at all the copies that we have and find out, the gross errors, and maybe there's a minor copying problems or what have you, and we can sort of sift through that and find out that the biblical text is actually quite accurate and hasn't really been changed, and there's no evidence that it's been changed. So that's looking at external sources and to the Bible, and looking at the text itself can help us judge, to help us have some grounding for our faith, and because a lot of people are going to attack Christianity and saying it's unreasonable to believe that these writings are true or whatever. So it's hard to talk with them because they're into science and history and all this kind of stuff. And so you've got to get on their level a little bit to help refute some of their claims, because they're making claims based on what they think the scientific evidence says or the historical evidence says. And when you examine their claims up front, as Mr. Campbell makes a lot of claims about the biblical and about the Bible and history, and he makes a lot of claims, but we look at the historical record and the record of the text itself. We could look at the very Bible itself and find out, some of these things as well.
Laying down a foundation for our epistemology, which is the study of what is knowledge and the justification of truth. Now, going back to your first chapter, Test for Truth, you talk about rational empiricism and the epistemology that Joseph Campbell uses to test his truths. What are those, Tom?
Well, again, I think my viewpoint is that the Holy Spirit works through our mental activities. So when we read the biblical text, the Holy Spirit is working through our minds, and presenting us with a reasonable faith. reasons why we can believe in our faith. And I believe that the laws of logic, like the law of non-contradiction, stem from God, who placed them in our hearts, and we suppress this truth and this knowledge, among other knowledges that God has given us in the not only His Word, but also in the natural revelation. The heavens declare the glory of God. But people suppress this idea. We're made in God's image, and although our image is very devastated by the fall of Adam, has been very distorted and corrupted, there still is this Holy Spirit can still work through that corruption to transform us and use our minds. And that's why I believe that we can use the laws of logic. Often the scientist talks about the laws of logic, and they say, well, where do they come from? Where do the laws of logic come from? What is reasonable to believe or not to believe? And it seems to me that the scientist has faith in logic and faith in science, but we have a better grounding for our ideas because God produces that laws of logic and builds those. The nature is consistent. Even though it may be damaged by the fall, it's still consistent. So that's my idea, my approach in the book.
We are talking about someone that you may or may not have heard of, Joseph Campbell. And when I say you may or may not have heard of Joseph Campbell, you have almost certainly heard of many of his ideas. They have become very popular in the university campuses and on public television, and all the places where we really...
Well, it's not only just that as well. It appears to me that they use Joseph Campbell as the centerpiece for the secular men's movement.
Sure. And again, he's sort of filling in this gap. I mean, it's kind of like evolution was to so many people in the 19th century who were just looking for something to grab a hold of that didn't involve God and the truths of Scripture. And I think Joseph Campbell has very much fulfilled that role in the 20th century as far as people's thinking about the hereafter and many other ontological questions. Now, I noticed, Tom, that is this correct that the term that we're so familiar with now, politically correct truth, is something that was introduced by Joseph Campbell?
No, that term was not introduced, but this idea that there's a politically correct truth out there, the idea, the meaning behind that idea is he was one of the main proponents of this, because he adopted this, and he puts up this whole big act in the interview with Bill Moyers about, people disagree with me because, and my research are just a bunch of idiots because they're fundamentalists and they're intolerant and they're judgmental and they bought into these old-fashioned ideas about God or about who Jesus was, and scientists proved them wrong. So he kind of comes up with a self-righteous attitude toward people who disagree with him, and he doesn't really examine any of the evidence that some of the top Christian scholars and Christian philosophers and Christian theologians and Christian pastors have presented about these matters, and he just treats them in a very superficial way.
Okay, well, we've kind of examined the background of what we're talking about and its relevance. Let's start, I guess, by diving into the whole topic with a little biography of Joseph Campbell, where I know that you make the point in the book that he has been, a lot of his ideas, well, at least he had some presuppositions that very strongly influenced his thought later on in life. Tell us about Joseph Campbell, the man, and some of the influences in his life early on that showed up as he began to write.
Well, he was born in 1904 in New York City, and he became, early on in his childhood, he went to Catholic schools, Roman Catholic schools, but early on he became fascinated with Native American culture, myth, and folklore because he attended Buffalo Bill's Wild West show and the American Museum of Natural History. And then when he started to hear about being taught Christianity from the nuns in the Roman Catholic schools, or so he claims, he found that there was a lot of similarities in these Native American myths, or Native American religious stories and religious ideas. So then, eventually, he went on to Columbia University, and before graduating in 1925, he met a spiritual leader from India on a boat trip to Europe, and he started to study Hinduism and Buddhism. And again, he detected the similarities between these religious ideas and religious rituals and religious stories, or myths, as he likes to call them. Now, later on, he gravitated away from Hinduism because he went to India in 1954, and after seeing how poverty-stricken it was, he kind of became more Buddhist in his philosophies, and in the 60s, the Zen Buddhism at the same time started becoming popular, and he picked up on it right away really quickly. So he's very influential in the 60s, as were the Zen Buddhists. And basically that's how he started writing. There have been other influences on his life, like Heinrich Zimmer, a famous scholar on the art, religion, and philosophy of India. Now, he began writing in the late 30s and in the 40s, but his probably his most popular work is The Hero with a Thousand Faces, at least before the Power of Myth series. And that was in 1949, where he goes through this hero myth idea and hero stories. And that's where George Lucas borrowed from some of those ideas in that book, not all of which are bad, by the way, but it's also tinged by this Buddhist philosophy in Star Wars. If you look at the Star Wars films in particular, Buddhism, and then later on, and especially the second Indiana Jones film, there's a very occultic type ideas are popular in that. Now, the first Indiana Jones film, the third Indiana Jones film, are more conventional, since they deal with Moses and Jesus Christ, those two films. But you detect this kind of influence in Campbell. And right now in Hollywood, people are always, the scriptwriters are talking about heroes and trying to establish heroes, and they borrow from Campbell a lot. Although lots of times they don't borrow the Buddhist philosophy. Lots of times, but some of the New Age thinking has gravitated into their films.
Almost sounds like a child of the 60s before the 60s. I don't know if that's being reductionistic or whether... I guess it's like you say, it is this strong Eastern influence that seems to be prevalent in his life, both the Hinduism, I guess, originally, and then on into the Buddhism. So from that point, he begins to write the books that you mentioned that have made him extremely popular. Now, in the introduction to your book, you go on from his biography to talk about his 7 basic themes, and I think probably now would be the best time to go ahead and try to elaborate on those and go from there.
Well, first of all, is his idea of truth. He says there is no absolute truth. Now, in Christianity, we believe that there's an absolute truth, and it's based in God and Jesus Christ. So, but he doesn't believe in an absolute truth. So that's one of the ideas. Another idea is he doesn't believe in any moral absolutes. He says there are no moral absolutes. Now, a quick way to refute that when somebody approaches you is to ask them, okay, are you telling me that I ought not to believe in moral absolutes? In other words, they are establishing their own moral absolute, and their moral absolute is that there are no moral absolutes, and you shouldn't believe it, and you're intolerant and judgmental and almost evil in a way if you believe in moral absolutes. And of course, as Christians, we believe in moral absolutes based in the Bible. A third of his 7 aspects were religious stories or myths should never be taken as fact. You should never believe they are literally true. We should just feel them and experience them. So
perhaps
Christians who try to think about their faith and try to develop these systematic theological points, and sometimes we can get carried away, but he doesn't like it at all. And he just says, feel it this way, and he interprets them in this way. And of course, we believe that Jesus Christ actually rose from the dead, so it's a historical fact.
Perhaps at this point we need to go ahead and more thoroughly define this word myth. It is misunderstood quite a bit. Let's talk about what a myth is and what it isn't. In other words, people assume when they hear the word myth that we're talking about a fable, something that is a story and from the very beginning is not at all assumed to be true or have any kind of truth to it. perhaps something that contributed to it, but no real truth to it. Now, according to you in your book, this is not an accurate definition of the word myth.
No, as I said, while I was researching my dissertation, I looked at other people in this field, and they didn't seem to have the same definition as Joseph Campbell had, and his definition relies more on the popular idea of myth, whereas these other scholars in this comparative religion field were trying to not trying to look at the structure of stories, the structure of religion, and not trying to decide whether a particular religion was real or fictional. They wanted to discover the meaning. What does religion mean, and why do so many people? Why do we have so many religions, and why do we have so many people who seem to have a religious bent in some way? So that's what they were kind of studying. And so one way to define a myth is as just a simple religious story, but it also can be a popular culture story. For instance, we might talk about the hero myth and all these images of heroes that we have in our popular art and in previous art. And we might also talk about villains. You know, we have this idea of villains and what evil is and what evil is not. And I like to also apply myth not only just to fictional stories, but also to true stories. For instance, to stories about Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln was born in a log cabin, and he became president of the United States. Well, that's kind of that whole idea, that Horatio Algier almost type of story that many people have accomplished in their lives. Does that mean that Abraham Lincoln wasn't born in a log cabin, or did he become president of the United States? No, we can talk about why that story appeals to people, about the Horatio Algier story, because people do actually accomplish such things in real life. So journalism, I also look at journalistic, our front page, we could look at heroes and villains that the press tries to make out. Well, here's a hero and here's a villain. Does that mean that the person isn't a hero or isn't villainous? No. So I take a more, the approach of these other scholars, where
a more classic view.
Any real or fictional story, it doesn't have to be. We don't have to judge right away whether it's true or false. We can judge that later on other grounds, like whether it's historically accurate, or whether it has eyewitness testimony, whether it's internally consistent. That's my test for truth, and that's a different thing than just trying to find the structure behind these stories and the way people like to pick up on these things.
You're listening to Christian Answers Live. I'm Lee Meckley, along with Jim Tungate, and we're talking about Joseph Campbell and the New Age. The name of a book by Tom Snyder, Myth Conceptions, Joseph Campbell and the New Age.
We're just trying to find the meaning out of stories, different stories. We can call any story a myth, even a story on the front page of the newspaper that may perfectly be true. But these, lots of times scholars talk about some story that's mythic, and what they mean by that is that it appeals to people or humanity in general. It appeals to maybe a group of people, a particular culture, because it portrays cultural ideas or human ideals, cultural ideals as well, or even divine ideals that we get from a religious text, like the Bible, which, as a Christian we think is the basic truth system that we get. And it also expresses deep emotions or stimulates ideas that seem to have almost divine or human quality, where many cultures have the similar ideas. But we need to make distinctions, and we need to be a little bit careful when we do this kind of work, or else we get caught up in like Campbell, where we see Buddhist philosophy and all sorts of religious stories, even in the Bible, where which a lot of New Age people try to do. But when you look at the context of the religious text of the Bible, you find that lots of times they take these verses out of context, and that's what I'm trying to fight against.
I think you hit it right on the head whenever you talked about emotion. A lot of the people that I know and that I'm familiar with who particularly hold to the views that Joseph Campbell sets forth, I think the biggest one is that it appeals emotionally to these people, and it gives them a good, nice, ooey-gooey feeling.
Right, and people are attracted to stories, but I like stories too. But I also think that stories can be intellectually stimulating. They don't just have to be appeal to the emotions; they can appeal to your intellect. And as a matter of fact, I like stories that seem to uplift the intellect and the emotions, and especially that's why these stories of Christ, the true stories of Christ, by the way, are so uplifting because they get us into looking toward God and bring us closer to God. The Protestant reformers, for instance, believed that the biblical text was a means of grace. The Holy Spirit worked through these true historical accounts of Jesus' life and his teachings. And we are lifted up to God, and God comes down to us. And so that's why. Sometimes people want counterfeits and substitutes. They invent Christ substitutes in their New Age philosophy or in their neo-pagan philosophy to substitute for the real message that God is delivering through the New Testament.
Okay, back to our 7 basic themes of Joseph Campbell's thought.
Just one more thing. Back to that for a moment. I think a lot of it is that people want a God of Jell-O or of clay dough,
Right.
who they can mold after their own image. Well, my God would never do that. He would never send anybody to hell. Not my God.
That's exactly right, and that's why theologians and other Christian writers try to explain this and show why it's not unreasonable to believe this, and why we can have a good God and a just God. God is just as well as loving, and Paul makes the point in 1 Corinthians. A lot of people talk about love, for instance, and they come up with these gushy definitions of love, but clearly in 1 Corinthians 13, Paul says, love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. So a doctrine of hell is perfectly loving and truthful and just as far as that goes.
Okay, theme number 4. We've talked about the lack of absolute truth, the lack of moral absolutes, religious myths being completely false. What was the 4th major theme of Joseph Campbell's thought?
Well, one of the fourth ones the fourth one I like to place fourth, although you can arrange these in different positions, is the idea that Western civilization is mostly bad. It is racist and power-driven.
Where have I heard that before?
It also has little or no respect for nature, whereas Native American history and culture is so pure and so noble. This is really a false idea. That's floating around out there, and Campbell buys into this. And of course, who does he blame? He blames the Christians.
Well, now, let me ask you, is this something that he's bought into, or is this something that he, well, perhaps not originated, but has actually breathed new life into? And can we actually say that the environmentalism and so forth that we know of now is something that influenced Campbell, or was something that was influenced by Campbell?
I think there's a back and forth going on here. That he's very influenced by them, but he was on the cutting edge because he developed. Other people worked on Native American religion and culture, and come to similar conclusions. Other people don't come to similar conclusions. If you look at the history, you find that there was warfare between Native Americans. There was slavery. There was cannibalism. There was even ritual sacrifice. Mm-hmm. We don't want to go to the other error and say that their culture had nothing whatsoever good in it, that these people were completely evil, because that would be a racist and biased, a prejudice. That would be bigoted. But we don't want to do what Campbell did, which is make them out to be like these noble savages. Campbell has no doctrine of sin.
That's exactly what the New Age movement has done as well.
Right,
with
right.
Native American religion, it's become very prevalent. And just, I think it was a couple of weeks ago, I believe it was Time Magazine, I saw a picture in there of our First Lady, Hillary Clinton, being blessed by a Native American shaman. And you find it everywhere. You go into the bookstores, and a large part of the books that you'll find in the New Age section deal with Native American thought, which, by the way, is basically pantheism, the idea that, God is in everything and everything is in God,
That's
which
right.
also, if you follow that logically, that would mean that we're God as well.
Yeah, but see, they're reinterpreting this culture and a lot of these religious stories too. So, who knows what the truth is? I'm not a Native American scholar per se, but I am. I did research in American history, and I found out, several books mentioned in my book. The research indicates that the Western civilization, although there were problems and it didn't treat the Native Americans rightly and correctly, it doesn't stem from their Christianity. As a matter of fact, Christian history, if you look at Christian history, it's developed a lot of great things, like our educational system. Our founding fathers were mostly Christians, and a lot of their best ideas, if not all of their best ideas.
Well, that and a lot of missionaries as well went out to the camps to go out and be with the natives to take the gospel to them. Then also, whenever the natives were taken out to reservations, it was also missionaries and Christians who brought them food when they were starving.
That's right, and I'm, the modern New Age people and people like Joseph Campbell totally distorted history about this. And sure, abuses took place, but guess what? Some of the missionaries tried to stop the abuses.
Mm-hmm.
There are even Spanish missionaries who tried to stop the abuses. Now, maybe some of the missionaries did do abuses as well, but the history just doesn't show that. As I said, if you look at the Aztecs, they had a brutal culture. As a matter of fact, when Cortez stormed Mexico, he got a lot of help from the coastal Indians who had been enslaved by the Aztecs.
His influence shows up especially in environmentalism, politically correct thought, a lot of the multiculturalism. Right. And I would even say that I'm going to ask our guest about this, but I think he's probably very much influencing the historical revisionism that seems to be so prevalent nowadays. Anyway, we'll talk about that. Our guest is Tom Snyder. He is author of the book Myth Conceptions, Joseph Campbell and the New Age, published by Baker Bookhouse. Tom teaches philosophy, aesthetics, social science, and film at National University in Southern California. He holds a Ph.D. in film studies from Northwestern University and has done postdoctoral research in Christian apologetics at Simon Greenleaf's School of Law. And Tom, thank you very much for joining us again for the second hour.
Thanks a lot. It's good to be here.
Okay, when we left last hour, we, of course, had talked about Joseph Campbell himself, his biography, and then we began to talk about the 7 basic themes of Joseph Campbell's thought, and those were so far in no particular order. The idea of no absolute truth. Secondly, the idea of no moral absolutes. And already this should be sounding familiar to you if you have had any experience at universities or listening to excessive amounts of public television. Number 3, religious myths are not true. In other words, the stories and the stories that we find in any religion, they're just stories. They are not to be taken literally or to have any truth to them. And then the one we left off with was that Western civilization is bad. Basically, we are causing the problems throughout the world. It tends to be very much this idea of multiculturalism as it is manifesting nowadays in the universities across the country. And Tom, I believe you said that he specifically, he got more specific than that. He said specifically the Christians that are behind Western culture have been the source of the root of all evil.
Yeah, basically that's what he says, and I have a statement in my book from him about that very fact. So he blames Christianity of everything above all, and especially it's the idea of raping nature, just using nature as the commandment that God gives to Adam and Eve, and the in Genesis about have dominion. Of course, that meant stewardship, as well, that we take care of nature as well. So,
right.
So he misinterprets the biblical text to basically pigeonhole Christianity and to denigrate Christians.
Now, of course, to a certain degree, we always have a little bit of historical revisionism throughout the ages because history is by definition somebody's interpretation of history, but it does seem like it's more prevalent today in our universities and, alarmingly enough, in our public schools. The of course, we have the famous textbook cases now where there just seems to be a sloppiness with facts, a sloppiness with details and documentation. I mean, some very blatant
great events of history that are just completely left out altogether.
And this would seem to be a fairly recent phenomenon. Do you see this as being connected to what we've been talking about this evening?
Yeah, I think it gained to speed after World War II as Campbell, his works gained speed after World War II. And it's sort of like is a simultaneous outgrowth from that, and he's like one of the major figures in the so-called culture wars. And it really developed in the 60s when people started questioning American values and Western civilization values and bringing up issues of slavery and mistreatment of Indians without talking about the good things as well. It's sort of like a distortion of history and a revisionism, but it's not based in fact. And so I did do a survey of this idea, and to try to get back, I did a lot of research on Western culture and American history and Christian history, and showing all the good things about it. So I have a lot of sources material in my book. And after my book was published, there also came out another book, which isn't listed in my book, by M. Stanton Evans. It's called The Theme is Freedom, and he really tops it all off in his book. So although it's not mentioned in my book has other sources as well, but that you should be aware of in this historical revisionism so you can learn how to fight it.
Well, okay, so that is the fourth, this idea that Western civilization is bad and has caused all the problems, or most of the problems that we know of throughout history, or at least as long as Western civilization's been around. I don't know who they blame it on before that, but so that's the fourth theme that we have mentioned that we find in Joseph Campbell's thought. What is another theme?
Another theme is the idea is that scientific evolution is true, absolutely true. It's no question about it. We don't have
so
to
there's
question
an
it. We have to
absolute
accept
truth.
it. And not only that, but also he has religious beliefs have also evolved. And for instance, Campbell claims that Judaism and Christianity evolved from pagan religions. And so not only in my book do I refute the evolution is true arguments, especially the human evolution is true, that we're descended from a common ancestor that we share with the apes. I also refute his viewpoint that Judaism and Christianity and the Bible, in effect, evolved from pagan religions. That's just not true. There's been a lot of research, and it's in my book, but that early primitive societies had, along with a lot of bad ideas, they also had monotheistic ideas and ethical ideas. And so the ideas that you get in the Bible, in the Old Testament and the New Testament, are nothing new. Some of the earliest and most primitive tribes have monotheism run through them. And the research is pretty clear on that. And Campbell, interestingly, although he goes through the evolution of religion, he never picks up on this research, which is as old as 1930.
No, we have
He conveniently ignores this research, and I find it very interesting.
We have a really good friend that is a missionary. His name's Dave Sitton, and he was a missionary in Papua New Guinea for 19 years.
Right.
And the first tribe that Dave went and visited was a tribe of cannibals. And so he's in this village with the cannibals, and they'd already pretty well accepted him, and he's sitting in the tent. And one of the approaches that he uses is to find a common memory and history. And this tribe still remembered, through having it passed down through oral tradition for all these years, the flood. So you have this tribe way out in the jungle in Papua New Guinea that knows about the flood.
That's exactly.
And he's
Not only
also
that,
found
they
other
also know
tribes.
about the one true God.
Mm-hmm.
Oftentimes, the research is clear, and see, this is important because in the Bible we have Adam and Eve, the first man, the first woman, and they knew God personally. And later on, after the fall, mankind started getting up into all these other religions, and we find the historical research that this is true. The earliest, as far back as we can't really go back as far as the archaeology and anthropology. We don't have Adam and Eve's bones. But as far back as we can go back, you find the idea of a personal God who demands, has moral absolutes of human beings is as ancient as any other religious idea. And the research clearly shows it, and I go through it in my book, and Campbell's wrong, and he conveniently ignores this research, which is really infuriating.
Well, I wanted to go back to something that Jim said earlier. Is there not, I mean, even within Joseph Campbell's mind, wasn't there an apparent contradiction between him saying that evolution is a fact and starting off by saying that there's no such thing as absolute truth?
Yeah, that's exactly right. There's a big contradiction right there. He said earlier in his interview with Bill Moyers, the person who thinks he has found the ultimate truth is wrong. Well, he's found this ultimate truth of evolution. It affects his whole approach to religious stories and to science and versus religion.
Well, that and his basic ultimate truth that he found that there is no ultimate truth is also another underlying foundation.
Yeah, all these first 5 things that I mentioned are based in his one of his last 2 ideas, and this is his doctrine of God. And his doctrine of God is that God is impersonal, and that everything is God. You and I are God, and even the planet shares that divine nature, but it's an impersonal God.
Okay, so we've come to this point where we've developed that internally Campbell's work isn't consistent. Externally, his work isn't consistent.
Right.
Is he, as you asked the question in your book on page 42, is Campbell really in a position to know what he's talking about?
Well, see, that's just the whole question. He's never been in anthropological field research, and that's where you have to be. And that's some of my books that I use to refute him, especially when we're talking about anthropology, are from field research that people have done. And he has never really done this. He sort of like gets these religious stories secondhand, and he borrows from other scholars. And he's, I've never done the field research either, but it seems to me that there's plenty of evidence to refute him, and he conveniently, time after time, ignores the evidence against his position, whether he's talking about Western civilization or American Indians or Native Americans, or even if he's talking about the Bible or evolution. He conveniently ignores other research and data.
Okay, so the last 2 basic themes that run through his thought are that God is impersonal and God is everything.
Yeah, and the goal is to have a mystical union in a Buddhist-type way with this impersonal God.
Nirvana?
Yeah, you go sort of like empty your mind at one point. He goes all over the map. But I describe this viewpoint as mystical pantheism, and it affects all the others. It affects all those other ideas, especially the first 5 I mentioned. These 7 themes are all part of what is often called the culture wars, and I think you'll find a lot of people hold these beliefs.
Now, also on page 42 of your book, which we at Christian Answers heartily recommend this book, and we encourage you to go out to your local Christian bookstore and get a copy of Myth Conceptions by Tom Snyder, and that is published by Baker Bookhouse.
If they don't if they don't have it, ask them why. They don't.
But on page 42, question number 7, you say that if carried out to their logical conclusions, what are the possible results of the 7 main themes of Campbell's work?
Well, I think that the ultimate results are regimes like Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin. And not only I list books which show that in my book. There's also a new book out that I mentioned, but the theme is Freedom by M. Stanton Evans, and he really puts the capper on it. And this is what happens from these neo-pagan Buddhist philosophies, or you get regimes like India, where there's 90 million untouchables who are living in poverty, and it's just
have no chance of ever getting out.
Right, and this is why people ignore all the good things that Christianity and God through Christianity, has brought through the Bible and Christian history and tradition.
Yeah, for some reason, India does come up quite a bit in multicultural discussions, talking about this culture they've got there, and people don't realize what was going on in India before the missionaries, before William Carey got there. I mean, the widow of a man who had died was buried alive. No, she's burned alive.
On the funeral pyre.
On the funeral pyre. There's all kinds of monstrous practices going on with their newborn children being sacrificed and so forth and so on. And Christianity comes with the gospel, and these people are changed by the Spirit of God, and then these people like Joseph Campbell move into this area and then talk about all the evils after the gospel's made it safe for them to say anything at all without being thrown in jail. Then they use their freedom to talk about how evil Christianity is and all the terrible things that it's done and why we need to throw off these shackles and live by our own potential, not realizing what our own potential had done to us before the regenerating work of the Holy Spirit.
Yeah, and this is a big problem, and this is what they want to create in this today's society, but they don't realize it's clear that the history is so clear. There's just so many books out, and my book deals with some of the research. You just can find that what we're talking about is true. And I want to make a point about evolution, scientific evolution. There's no evidence that Homo sapiens sapiens, or modern man, is in any way related to those earlier bones that they find. No relationship at all between them, and there's a big gap.
And I guess in the time we have remaining, about 5 minutes, I would like to talk about some basic refutations of what we're dealing with. In other words, people that are listening to us are confronted by this on a regular basis. That's the whole point of this particular broadcast. What are some of the responses that you would make or you would have someone make when they obviously recognize the presuppositions behind the person that is speaking to them. They obviously recognize where this person is coming from, that he's coming from this kind of worldview. What were some of the things that you would have our listeners respond with?
Well, I'd first try to find out where exactly they're coming from, and I'd also try to develop the conversation by asking them, do they believe in absolute truth? And if they say no, there is no such thing as absolute truth, then you can start talking to them and say, well, is that an absolute truth, and do you believe it absolutely? And the moral absolute things, as I talked about earlier in belief, they still have their moral absolutes, and point out the error, how their own viewpoint is inconsistent. And ask for research and evidence. What's the evidence? Give me some solid evidence. We don't just quote scholars. We want to also say what their evidence is. And there's all sorts of proofs for why we can believe the Bible is historically accurate.
Now, basically, isn't this just existentialism?
Well, it's people have mixed worldviews, so they will find any convenient excuse to not deal with their sin and not deal with Jesus Christ, the real Jesus Christ who came down in history. They'll pick up any excuse from wherever it is, and they'll sort of it's called syncretism. They'll develop beliefs, all non-Christian beliefs from all over, whatever works for them to try to avoid the issues that you're going to bring up.
It sounds like Romans 1.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Romans 1 is what's going on.
Well, okay, so by the way, there's something else I was going to mention. We were talking about contradictions in what we're being told. Quite often, talking about this with Eastern thought, Ravi Zacharias gives this illustration, or this example actually, of someone that was talking to him and saying, no, you've got all wrong, you're not thinking correctly, you're thinking in Western thought of the law of non-contradiction, either or. You need to start understanding what Hinduism and Buddhism say. There's no either or to it. It's both and. It's dialectics and so forth. And Ravi let him finish this whole conversation and said, "Are you through?" And the person says, "Yeah, that's basically what I wanted to say." And so Ravi says, "Let me get this straight. You're saying that it's either the Western system or the Eastern system." And the person just leans back in their chair and says, well, I guess there is a contradiction there. I mean...
That's exactly right. They do this all the time. It's bad critical thinking. They don't know what they're talking about, basically. And once you start poking holes in this, it's so clear, and it's hard because sometimes they just refuse to see.
And what's very revealing is I've seen conversations like this going on where someone will essentially poke the argument so full of holes that it falls apart. And when it falls apart, quite often what the person will say is, well, if God came down from heaven and revealed himself to me, I wouldn't accept him because I just don't, I heard one person give the excuse of, I don't like the way he treated the Philistines in the Old Testament. My response to something like that is, if you don't want him to treat you the same way, I recommend that you accept his offer. But
well, these are just so silly. I don't believe in Bill Clinton until he shows up right on my doorstep. I mean, how silly. He's not president. I don't have to obey anything he says, or the Supreme Court until they show up on my doorstep. How stupid is that?
I don't believe in the IRS.
Yeah, I don't believe in the IRS. You're not going to pay your taxes.
Well, there's lots of people that are doing that.
You'll find out that real quick.
Right.
Well, it's called eschatological verification. When you die, you're going to find out.
Well, thank you very much, Tom Snyder, for being on the program. Again, the book Myth Conceptions, Joseph Campbell and the New Age, published by Baker Bookhouse. And we thank you and hope to have you again on the program sometime.
Yeah, well, I really had fun. Thanks a lot, Lee and Jim.
Okay, God bless.
God bless you.
And this has been Christian Answers Live with Lee Meckley and Jim Tungate. We come your way from Christian Answers here in Austin. Our address, Post Office Box 144441, Austin, Texas 78714. And until next weekend, have a good week.
Thank you for joining us for Christian Answers Live. We hope you've enjoyed the show. Christian Answers Live is an outreach of Christian Answers. If you would like more information on this program or any of the resources available from this nationwide ministry, our address is Christian Answers, Post Office Box 144441, Austin, Texas 78714. That address once again is Post Office Box 144441, Austin, Texas 78714. Or call us at 512-218-8022. That's 512-218-8022.
Check out our websites. BibleQuery.org. This site answers 7,700 Bible questions. HistoryCart.com. This site reveals early church history and doctrine, proving Roman Catholicism is not historically or doctrinally viable. MuslimHope.com. This site is a classic refutation of Islam, a counterfeit religion created by Muhammad. Free newsletters are also available.